Hello, my name is Amjin Rakai, and today we're going to be talking about a theory that I think kind of starts to break down a little bit some of the hidden walls and barriers and borders, essentially, of the One Piece world and how some of them function, maybe. And before we begin, if you've liked any of my content, if you've seen anything so far, please like, share, and subscribe, and please leave a comment to help me out in the algorithm. We're so close to 300 subscribers. That would be a really cool milestone that I really cannot reach without all your help. And subscribing and turning on that bell notification and all that crap is the only way to ensure that you'll see my weekly One Piece, Berserk, and A Song of Ice and Fire content that I am trying to do here. But with that out of the way, let's get down to the meat of this video, which is the Sheriffs of the GrandLIE. I mean, the Grand Line. And when it comes to the word sheriff, we've actually only heard it mentioned once in the story, and it was in reference to that character, Laffite. Now, y'all remember Laffite, right? The member of the Blackbeard pirates who strolled into the upper decks of Mary Joa with a proposal for a replacement Tsujibaki after Crocodile had been defeated in Alabasta. And he's there to kind of propose the idea that Blackbeard could be a replacement for Crocodile as a Seven Warlord of the Sea. And when he arrives there, Suru of the Marines remarks that he was a former sheriff in the West Blue who was notorious for his brutality and was subsequently banished. Now, one, I kind of get the impression that Suru has been around the block a few times in the Marines, and the fact that she would remember this dude just makes me think that it's an important note. And she was also kind of the one who seemed to wrangle in Garp back in the day, as well as being sent to deal with Doflamingo, who had very sensitive information for the world government as far as they were concerned. So I do think there's a lot going on with her and her abilities and her importance later in the story. And even Sengoku refers to her about, for information about who Laffite is. So it's like, and he kind of seems to, know everything. So the fact that she remembers him, I do think is a clue to things as far as the history of the One Piece world, but I'm not going to go into that here. But she states that Laffite is from the West Blue, and we kind of know from the story that the West Blue seems to be the hub of the criminal underworld, and Nico Robin is from there, Brook is actually from there, Shanks is from there, Gecko Moria, Capone Baggy, a lot of characters that might have kind of ties to devils or being a devil, or maybe in service of the devil. Stuff like that, I do kind of think is being hinted at with this West Blue origin of Laffite. But the fact that he's from the same place that Shanks is from, and it's funny because I think we all kind of remember this scene, right? And I really haven't heard anyone else piece together that it's the exact same thing that Shanks did right before Wano started, except instead of with the upper ranks of the Marines, Shanks met with the upper ranks of what might be the world government, the Gorosei. And I actually think that's extremely fitting because when all is said and done here, I do believe that Shanks was the replacement as the new sheriff in town when Laffite lost his position in the past. I do not ultimately think that Laffite lost his rank of sheriff or his position as sheriff due to being too brutal. I just believe that the idea and effectiveness of a sheriff in the One Piece world has shifted from being one of brutality to one of being a much more cunning sort, which is what we're going to get into in this video later on. And I promise it will be very clear and make a lot more sense. But I said that Shanks and Laffite were essentially doing the same thing, just with different parties. And what I mean by that is that this is the moment where officially Blackbeard kind of gets on the radar of the Marines. Because at this point he's kind of a nobody, and Laffite has snuck in here, and he's recommending Blackbeard for the position as a Seven Warlord. Now, we know that's all kind of ultimately part of Blackbeard's plan, but I really actually think that Laffite is the mastermind behind all the Blackbeard pirate stuff, which we will get to. But in this moment, that's what Laffite's doing, and the request is kind of denied, and he's told that Blackbeard has to prove himself, which he eventually does by apprehending Ace. A very sheriff-like thing to do, apprehending a quote-unquote criminal and bringing them in for a bounty of some sort. Well, I think on the surface level, Shanks is doing the same thing. He shows up to Marineford, and I think that one interpretation or possibility could be that he's there to discuss Luffy, and that after that, Luffy has to prove himself, and that proving himself is taking out Kaido in Wano, and then afterwards he gets the title of Yonko, and it's just instead of the 7 Warlord job application, it's a Yonko application. And I believe the same could be said for Buggy, maybe, that Shanks is here to discuss Buggy and perhaps his lineage. But while I think that those are 2 very good possibilities, I honestly think that Shanks is here to discuss Vivi and to tell them for sure, verbatim from his mouth, that Vivi, as a princess of essentially the world government, as a participating kingdom, that one of its members is a pirate. And that's actually what I meant earlier when I said that the type of sheriff that was effective in the One Piece world has changed from maybe Lafayette's past, where it was more brutality and power, to being more about brokering information and kind of being masters of intelligence, so to speak. And I think that the idea of gathering and using that information and intelligence behind the scenes to control and pull the strings of the One Piece world is what Shanks ultimately is doing here, and what the Gors say are in some form a cog in the wheel of. And I know this is not a popular opinion, but I actually think that Sword is a huge part of that. And I think that Sword, we think all these things, but I believe all the Sword stuff is kind of a reference to the pen, and the pen being mightier than the sword. And we don't have to really go too far to get to journalism from the word sword, because just imagine the letters of the word sword in your head right now. Now take off that S and put it at the end of the word, and you have words. So I think that sword kind of being a propaganda machine within the Marines that utilizes the news and various printings and publications around the One Piece world to create borders and barriers in people's minds and perceptions and place limitations on the One Piece world is what Sword's ultimate goal is, and that it's not actually a good organization. I believe its main purpose is to use the pen and the words of a pen to act like a sword and create division and strife within the One Piece world by, propagating racism and various other rhetoric that continues the hate to live on, so to speak, in the One Piece world. And now I think that actually Big News Morgan is not part. He might be part of Sword, but he's acting rogue. I think he might be a good journalism. He might be an example of like crazy bird gonzo journalism or something like that, who's ultimately searching for the truth. But that is not what I think that Sword is, and I think that's one of Oda's big tricks that's kind of been propagated by YouTube, and I think he's kind of played with that more and more as time has gone on. And I know that can really sound abrasive and crazy, but one of the first main hints that we get of Sword is Akainu's tattoo in this chapter cover here. And the idea to me that Akainu would be in an organization that would be good really doesn't sit well with me. But also, the very first time we meet Akainu during the Marineford War, he actually uses misinformation to basically create an attack from Whitebeard's blind spot to wound him with Squardo. Akainu lies to Squardo about events in the past which force him in his mind to need to try to kill Whitebeard himself. So to me, this idea that Sword is, using words and misinformation to essentially create betrayals around the One Piece world has been hinted at since we've kind of first ever maybe thought about it. But I'll touch more on that in future videos. Coming back to the sheriff idea, we know that in some form Shanks seems to be, on paper, waiting for Luffy. And I think it's fair to assume that any pirate that's not Luffy, that has gotten to the point that he resides in, maybe towards the end of the Grand Line, that their travel is stopped at that point because they fight him and they get turned around or they die, whatever. He's essentially making sure that certain pirates do not pass a certain point on the Grand Line to make sure they don't reach a destination. Now, that reason for doing that, maybe Shanks is good, and maybe he's doing it because he thinks it's going to save the world, and he only wants someone who's responsible and good, so to say, like Luffy and the Straw Hat Pirates, to claim the One Piece treasure. So that's what he's kind of been doing. But I don't really think that's what's going on. I do think that he is involved, but he could be just doing it naturally. I think that Blackbeard is doing something very similar, and he might not be privy to it. But Shanks specifically, I think, has set a trap for Luffy since the very first page of Chapter 1, and that the ultimate culmination of that trap is the end of the Grand Line awaiting for him. And Parvision has a great video about some maybe inner workings about the Shanks underworld and how he's involved in that. And like I said earlier with the whole South Blue origin clue and stuff like that. So check his video out. I think there's a lot of great points there. I agree with a lot of them. I think that there's a lot going on with Shanks. I do think it is much more advanced and involved and brutal and disgusting than just what was put forth there. But I'll get to that in future videos. But either way, for whatever reasons, Shanks at a certain point in the Grand Line is a wall and is making sure that pirates don't get past a certain point. Now, I said earlier that Blackbeard was doing that too, and he is. He's just doing it with fruits. He's doing it with devil fruits. And because of his actions and what the plans for whatever he's scheming, he needs devil fruits. And he is making sure that specific devil fruits that he is after, that he's hunting after for his crew to use or to reuse or whatever, he's making sure that those fruits don't make it past a certain point on the Grand Line too. And I know that can kind of sound confusing at first, but if Shanks is essentially not letting bad apples in the form of people get to a certain point in the Grand Line, I think that Blackbeard's doing the same thing, but with bad fruits maybe. And by bad fruits, I mean certain devil fruits that might be activated at a certain point on the Grand Line maybe, or just the idea that these powers, when they get to a certain place or region or origin point on the Grand Line, that maybe something bad could happen, or at least something out of control power-wise that the Marines couldn't contain. So all these things kind of combine to make sure that no matter what, that doesn't happen, whether the parties that are carrying out those kind of actions and orders are aware of it or not. The end result is that certain people and certain fruits do not make it past a checkpoint for whatever reason. And now we're actually going to get into that reason right now. And to do that, we have to go back and look at exactly what Roger did and was doing to become the Pirate King. And when it comes to Roger, I know a lot of emphasis is kind of placed on him and Luffy having the same dream. And I know a big idea in the community is that it's about partying, and you have to watch my Wake Up About Being Sake video for kind of my retort of that. But at the very least, I do not think it's partying. For one thing, Roger seems to drink all the time. Luffy doesn't seem to like alcohol, and Luffy wouldn't view a party as a party without food, and Roger probably wouldn't view a party as a party without alcohol. But when it comes to partying, the Roger pirates don't even seem to have a musician. So I do not believe that they placed an emphasis on partying at the very least. But I do believe there's a lot to the idea that whatever they both made a wish for, or whatever, centered around the idea of gluttony, and maybe the idea of eating something. And that might not seem like a dangerous idea or dream, but in the One Piece world where literally food has been weaponized, that could actually be a very dangerous thing, and let me explain what I mean. There's all these ideas about what Roger's saying, but we actually do know one thing that he said and one dream that he had, and that was to circumnavigate the world. Now, on paper, that doesn't really make sense that that's super dangerous to the world. Now, then you can make the argument that the barriers and walls of the One Piece world exist how they do to make sure that no one knows the truth of anything. So the idea that someone could actually go around the world and find out the true history and whatever would be a very dangerous thing. And maybe there would be some aspect to like proving the world was round or something that could uproot the knowledge and teachings of the One Piece world. But it seems like the One Piece world is known as being round, and the secrets of finding the One Piece treasure and what it actually does do not seem to be as widespread as the treasure itself, obviously. So what could be something easier that could tie all this together that the world government maybe wouldn't want to have happen because it might make some individual too powerful? Well, I kind of think that the easy answer is someone who would trying to eat all of the devil fruits. Now, I know that we're told by secret government agents that you can't eat two, but we've seen Blackbeard do it, so we know at least one person in the One Piece world has an ability to eat multiple devil fruits and utilize multiple devil fruits at once. So the idea is at least present in the One Piece story in some aspect, but on a much smaller scale. than being able to combine all of them together. So let's look at what we know about Rocks. We know the Rocks Pirates was an amalgamation of a ton of strong pirates of the era who all seem to be possessors of particular devil fruits and powers. And I think that on a symbolic level, the Rocks Pirates being viewed as one crew, one person with all of these powers combined might be being hinted at here, just in the form of individuals on one crew instead of one individual with a ton of different slices of fruit inside of them. And I understand that all of this stuff can sound very crazy and just a little bit of the most craziest things I've kind of found, which is we kind of all know Xebec means a type of naval vessel, a ship. It can also mean kind of the back end, the stern of a ship. Well, Sheriif actually can derive from a name, Sheriif, which Sheriif, the name, means boatman.
I'm exercising. I'm sleeping well. You're doing time. I'm doing the time of my life.
And I know that sounds really kind of crazy, but let's say for a second that Roger's dream and Luffy's dream both maybe have a love for food, and their simple dream is wanting to try and take a bite of every type of food in the One Piece world. Now, let's say for a second that that was your dream. The chances of you accidentally eating the wrong combination of devil fruits, and knowing that devil fruits seem to sometimes have a will of their own and to maybe to some extent choose their owner and kind of make their way to them somehow, that would be a very dangerous combination and kind of create the possibility of one individual naturally attaining this world-changing and shaping power just by wanting to try new foods in new places around the world. The possibility of that happening would increase exponentially by, a pirate who was just traveling around the world trying foods. And I know on paper, so far, no one on the Roger Pirates seems to display any devil fruit powers. And maybe they don't have any. Maybe it's all propaganda. But I think that to kind of keep these true secrets in the One Piece world hidden, all of the information available about it doesn't include the important bits. They don't want in the One Piece world, they don't want you to think about becoming king of the world or president of the world. They want you to seek after fame that means nothing, power that really means nothing. Being the pirate king, we've seen it. It's a position of fame and wealth, and it ultimately gets you killed within 3 panels. So it doesn't seem like the greatest job. And I believe that it's just one of these false rewards and false gold put out on purpose in the One Piece world to make sure that the powers that be stay safe and that no one is really after their throne, like Emu type thing. And this idea that, we're going to implant that you can't eat multiple devil fruits, even though the only character we've actually seen try to eat multiple devil fruits lived doing it. So we really have no reason to think, except for, like I said, some secret military agents saying that you can't combine them. What we've actually seen is that you can combine them. But as a function of this One Piece world propaganda machine, it needs to be information out in the open that, hey, if you eat these, you'll blow up. You cannot eat multiple devil fruits, you will die. If that was something you could do and could really disrupt and threaten the world government and the Marines, of course I think it's acceptable to believe that maybe they would put out on purpose the information that you can't combine them, so that they wouldn't be worried about essentially devil fruit fusions. And that's what I actually think that all of these sheriffs, whether they know it or not, on the Grand Line are actually doing, is making sure that one individual doesn't combine and eat all of the devil fruits and gain this sort of invincible power that actually could threaten the foundations of the One Piece world. And I think that could be something that could be accomplished in a couple of different ways, but one of them would probably just be eating the individual who might have these fruits, or a bunch of individuals that have these fruits all at once. And I do think there's a lot to the idea that this One Piece propaganda machine is essentially a conveyor belt into the mouth of the big bad wolf. But I don't have enough time to get into that here. And not to end this video on too crazy of a note, but I do believe that devil fruit fusions is what might be arriving at daybreak in this final saga. I've said before in other videos that I believe that we're kind of entering into the Android and Cell saga, and I believe that all that might be combined with the Majin Buu and everything right now with Vegapunk to ultimately kind of lead to fusions of every single type. Now, I actually have a whole Blackbeard video coming out about a whole bunch of other stuff, but for this video, I'm just gonna leave it with the idea that his name, Marshall D. Tiche, Marshall actually means a federal lawman, or a military officer, person in charge of the military, all sorts of stuff like that. And now the other main definition of marshal is to gather data for transmission, or to ceremoniously guide, conduct, or usher. And actually, teach and teaching can mean the same thing, to guide someone, or transmit data to them, you know, like teaching them stuff from a book. So to me, this idea that he's gathering devil fruits and fighting all these things for whatever reasons he is, for another purpose, or maybe for some other being to eat all of them without them knowing it, I think could be at play. And just to get full on crazy tinfoil conspiracy level, I believe that Jean Lafayette might be leading Blackbeard and the Blackbeard pirates back to a place to be eaten by what we think Roger might be, and have him ultimately be reborn with basically all the best devil fruit powers that the One Piece world has to offer. Essentially, this GrandLIE being a conveyor belt into the mouth of the big bad wolf, and that big bad wolf might be an ogre fish. And ultimately, this is all to put back in power the ancient line, or righteous line in the One Piece world's history, to put them back into power. All kind of relating back to the idea that Blackbeard, Black Bear, bear is the original meaning of the name Arthur. So King Arthur's name originally meant bear. We have Aguma the bear in the first chapter. Has a sword, Excalibur, all sorts of crazy stuff I'll have future videos on. And all of that combined with the original Holy Grail formulas, and how Percival was the first iteration of the finder of the Holy Grail, and then over time he was deemed bad. You know, societies change, values change, so as do the heroes. And I believe that the One Piece world has kind of reflected that with who's in control of the era, so to speak, and who maybe is mainly after that control of that dream in each era. But I'll have more on that stuff on future videos, and the idea that Marshall, Teach, Black Bear, Blackbeard is tied to Perseus, the Sacker of Cities, I will be touching on in future videos. But of course, that does kind of tie into everything that we're talking about here, that Blackbeard could essentially be the bag that holds the magic fairy dust in any sort of myth. And just like we always see these swirly, patterned bags of treasure and goods being stolen from places, I believe that Blackbeard's basically unknowingly ushering in and marshaling a bunch of things and people and fruits to a certain place for a certain, you know, ritual that he either knows about or doesn't know about. Basically what I'm saying is that Blackbeard too, like most of the characters in the One Piece world, are being used by someone else as a mule, and is basically being used to transport magical MacGuffins, whether they're people, fruits, or treasures, to a certain location for some certain purpose. And I know that all of this Sheriff and plans behind the scenes and multiple puppet string masters and all this stuff is really, really crazy. Well, just to add on to the craziness, my great friend Elson has found some huge stuff relating to sheriffs and perhaps a member of the Roger Pirates, Scopper Gaban. And I'm going to have all sorts of videos in the future about all of the eras of animation and manga and any sort of art forms that Oda has been referencing, and how he constantly kind of rotates through the eras when it comes to referencing it. I think the closer we get to the end, we're actually getting closer to the beginning, so to speak, of animation and manga. And this sheriff thing is a big clue to that, I think. There is a famous anime from the 80s called Space Sheriff Gaban, or Space Cop Gaban. All kind of with that name, I think. And I think Oda's referencing that with Scopper Gaban, the copper, Scopper, Space Copper Gaban, from the Roger Pirates. And I think that Oda has been touching on that, and the design of the Space Sheriff Gaban is extremely similar to the helmet that this Shaka satellite bodies design. And if that wasn't crazy enough, I've been referencing this Bird Kingdom and Chicken Wing Kingdom and stuff like that, and well, Space Sheriff Gaban actually comes from the Bird Planet. And in the story, Gaban is sent to Earth from Planet Bird to defend it from someone named Don Horror. And now this is actually a very real science phenomenon in our real world when it comes to things being sent to planet Earth, sent into the Goldilocks zone of a star to kind of help life form. And there's lots of evidence to mushrooms doing those exact same things. And you'll have to check out a video I have coming up in the future called The Future Mushroom King about more about this stuff. But I think in a very real way, outside of all the references to Superman and Goku of a savior being sent to Earth from an alien planet, I think Oda's also playing with the idea that there are organisms and fungi and food that might be sent to help humans as well. Maybe devil fruits, maybe other things. But when it comes to this video, I think the idea of a person or a mole infiltrating a pirate crew to make sure that they don't ultimately succeed in whatever that goal is, I think maybe being hinted at here with Gaban, and how justice is very rarely a sword, it's usually a hammer or an axe. And I think that that axe kind of chopping down and cutting off the head of certain individuals who hope to actually change the One Piece world is kind of the purpose of most of the sheriffs in this world. And speaking of things being sent down from the mothership, and that actually ties into someone who I'll end the video on, which is Mihawk, and how he kind of ties into all of this Sheriff and mainly information gathering and bringing it back to the mothership deal. First off, he does report to Shanks the progress of Luffy as soon as he first meets him. And when we first actually meet him, somehow he drives Don Krieg backwards on the Grand Line. They somehow go reverse on Reverse Mountain, comes up through there, and just for fun, continues to terrorize Don Krieg and his crew. So I believe that Don Krieg being the wrong type of pirate that they want on this version and model of the Grand Line is at play here, and that ultimately Mihawk was there to, okay, the first phase of this assembly of the Straw Hat crew, or the optimal Straw Hat crew that Shanks has planned out, that first leg has been completed satisfactorily. And they're ready to move on to the next phase of the plan, which is the Straw Hat Pirates kind of cleansing the paradise side of the Grand Line. Shanks, your plan is, moving forward, etc. But with that, my name is Adam Jinrakai. Please leave a comment what you thought about all this craziness and any ideas you might have about some sort of secret sheriff, policeman type thing of the Grand Line, or what you might think that Shanks and Lafayette and all them are ultimately doing. And I will have future videos touching exactly on Lafayette as far as being the puppet master of the Blackbeard Pirates and other stuff in relation to that and other things we touched on in this video, of course. If you're interested in stuff like that, please subscribe. And thank you so much for watching this video. And I will talk to you all later. Bye-bye.